Case 1, Ted Haggard. The scandal did not begin with sirens or courtroom doors slamming shut. It began with a whisper. One man in Denver deciding to call a local news station and say out loud what nobody in American evangelical life ever expected to hear. It was November 2006, and Ted Haggard, the polished, smiling pastor who led a 14,000-member megachurch in Colorado Springs and served as president of the National Association of Evangelicals, woke up to a world that would never see him the same way again. Within hours, headlines erupted. A male escort claimed he had a 3-year relationship with one of the most powerful Christian leaders in America, a man who preached family values, purity, and moral discipline. The escort alleged drug use, specifically methamphetamine, and described repeated encounters that painted a picture wildly at odds with the Sunday sermons broadcast to millions. That morning, Haggard's name became shorthand for the greatest hypocrisy in modern evangelical history. To understand why the story struck so deeply, you have to remember who Ted Haggard was before the fall. He wasn't just another preacher with a microphone in a big building. He shaped national political conversations. He advised presidents. Journalists would describe walking into New Life Church as stepping into a flawless religious production. Sharp lights, an immaculate stage, flawless music, and a pastor with a calm, confident voice who spoke about holiness like a man who had mastered it. He fought loudly against same-sex marriage legislation, urging congregations across America to stand for biblical purity. To his followers, he appeared untouchable. To critics, he appeared unstoppable. Behind both beliefs, a secret he thought he had buried was waiting for the right moment to surface. When the escort's testimony went public, Haggard denied everything at first. He called the story a lie, the work of political sabotage. But investigators moved quickly. Church elders hired outside counselors, trying desperately to determine whether the man they trusted was being truthful. The pressure built within hours. Reporters camped outside the church. News vans surrounded his home. Haggard's wife and children were suddenly thrust into a national spectacle as rumors spread across television networks and newspapers questioned every past statement he had made about morality and temptation. Under that glare, Haggard's story began to crack. First came a partial admission, then a written confession. He acknowledged sexual immorality and a long period of struggle, words carefully chosen but unmistakably damning. The fallout was immediate. Haggard was forced to resign from New Life Church. The National Association of Evangelicals accepted his resignation within days. Church boards removed him from every single leadership role he once held with absolute confidence. Members of his congregation described the atmosphere as grieving a death, because the man they worshipped alongside, trusted with their marriages, and followed into national activism had built his public identity on a private lie. The substance abuse allegations intensified the heartbreak. Somewhere behind the tailored suits and tightly controlled sermons was a man in deep internal turmoil, wrestling with compulsions he never admitted until it was too late. The consequences rippled far beyond one fallen pastor. Evangelical networks reeled. Books were canceled, conferences reshuffled, members left churches entirely, feeling betrayed not just by Haggard, but by a system that often demands perfection and punishes confession long before it embraces recovery. Haggard eventually stepped away from the spotlight, seeking counseling and relocation, later starting smaller ministries outside mainstream evangelical structures. But the legacy was set. The scandal became a reference point in conversations about secret addictions within religious leadership. Proof that behind public preaching, private chaos can be growing quietly, waiting for one spark to burn everything down. The first case in this series marks one unforgettable truth. When addiction lives in the shadows of spiritual authority, exposure does not simply end a career, it tears apart entire communities in the process. The camera pulls back from the chaos of that first scandal, and the tone shifts for a moment. Before we move any further, welcome to Savage Case Files. If you're watching this, it means you're drawn to real, unfiltered storytelling, the kind that looks beneath the headlines, beneath the glossy sermons, beneath the stage lights, and asks what really happened when the doors closed and the truth finally came out. We dig into public records, interviews, independent investigations, and first-hand accounts to tell you stories most people never hear in church on Sunday morning. And if you value this kind of research-heavy documentary work, I'm asking you to do something simple. Subscribe to the channel right now. Hit that button. It costs nothing, but it keeps us motivated and supported so we can continue bringing you cases every single day. Your subscription truly makes a difference. Now, let's move deeper into the next story, because what comes after Ted Haggard is just as shocking. Case 2, Jim Bakker. Long before his name became synonymous with scandal, Jim Bakker radiated the kind of confidence that made people believe anything was possible. Television studios glittered under stage lights as he sold a vision of Christian prosperity, a theme park built for the glory of God, hotel towers rising out of North Carolina soil, and a broadcast empire that promised blessing for every viewer willing to plant a seed into the PTL ministry. Viewers saw a smiling pastor in brightly colored suits, his wife Tammy Faye at his side, eyes smeared with mascara and hope. What they did not see was the internal storm steadily gathering behind the curtain, a compulsive hunger for expansion, a craving for control, and a money addiction that eventually consumed every part of Bakker's life. The early years made it easy to believe. PTL memberships soared. Heritage USA attracted millions of visitors a year, drawing believers who saw the park as proof that faith could literally build a kingdom on earth. Every new building, every satellite contract, every televised pledge drive reinforced Bakker's sense that success wasn't just a metric, it was a calling. Staffers later described his obsession with numbers, his fixation on bigger budgets, bigger shows, bigger announcements. The gospel message slowly bent around the need to keep raising funds, and Bakker convinced himself that all of it was justified because it kept the machine running. But compulsions never stay hidden forever. By the mid-1980s, cracks began to show. Financial records didn't match internal reports. Private spending spilled far beyond ministry purposes, and hush money payments to cover personal failures started surfacing. Bakker had become dependent not on drugs or alcohol, but on the intoxicating feeling of money being promised, counted, collected, and spent. He built castles in the air and told himself God wanted each one. The moment people stopped giving, the entire illusion threatened to collapse. The first major blow came when reporters uncovered promises made to donors, lifetime resort vacations, exclusive lodging benefits, that PTL couldn't physically deliver because Bakker had oversold access far beyond the park's capacity. It wasn't just mismanagement. Investigators determined it was fraud. One donation plea after another piled up like unpaid debts to the truth. And then there was the infamous hush money payment to silence a young woman who accused Bakker of misconduct, a payment funneled through ministry funds. When that detail leaked, everything exploded at once. Federal investigators stepped in. FBI financial auditors combed through mountains of PTL records. Courtrooms filled with supporters on one side and furious former donors on the other. In 1989, Bakker stood before a judge who seemed determined to make an example out of him. The sentencing was historic. 45 years in federal prison, one of the harshest penalties ever handed down to a televangelist. As Bakker was escorted out, the dream of Heritage USA folded almost overnight. Buildings shut down, volunteers fled. Viewers turned away in disbelief. Millions of evangelical households realized the man who had preached about blessing and sacrifice had been fueling a personal addiction to unchecked spending and power disguised as ministry. Prison broke the spell. Behind bars, stripped of cameras, wealth, and applause, Bakker confronted the wreckage of his compulsions. Years later, he would claim transformation, release memoirs describing regret, and even return to broadcasting. But nothing could clean the stain from American religious history. Jim Bakker showed how a leader could lose everything, not to drugs or liquor, but to the intoxicating rush of money, influence, and the belief that God's work could be measured by square footage and bank statements. When the ministry dust settled, one sobering question lingered. How many people gave, prayed, and sacrificed because they believed they were building God's kingdom, when all along they had been feeding one man's addiction? Case 3. Jimmy Swaggart. One Sunday morning in 1988, Jimmy Swaggart walked toward a television pulpit that looked exactly the same as it always had. Cameras, brass railings, choir robes glowing under stage lights. But something was visibly breaking behind his eyes. For millions of viewers, this was the man who preached holiness louder than anyone in America. He condemned sexual sin with the fury of an Old Testament prophet, called immorality a cancer eating the church from the inside, and built a global television empire on the message that purity was non-negotiable. Yet sitting in a Baton Rouge hotel room just days earlier, a photographer's flash had ended his career in an instant. Investigators had caught him with a sex worker, and the one sin he preached against most relentlessly was suddenly the one he could no longer hide. Swaggart didn't deny what happened. What shocked the world was how he admitted it. In front of millions, he delivered one of the most unforgettable confessions in modern religious history. "I have sinned against you, my Lord," his voice broke. Tears streamed down his face, and for a moment there was silence. Not just in the sanctuary, but across American living rooms where believers sat frozen, unable to reconcile the charismatic preacher they trusted with the scandal unfolding before them. That confession wasn't prepared. It wasn't polished. It was raw, uncontrolled, and devastatingly human. Yet even as Swaggart repented on live television, a darker backstory was emerging. This wasn't a single moment of failure. It was part of a long shadow, one that insiders whispered had followed him for years. The downfall accelerated quickly. Church governance boards moved to defrock him. The Assemblies of God, the same denomination that had fueled his rise, stripped away his credentials. Ministries rushed to distance themselves from the scandal, and reporters kept digging. They unearthed details about ongoing behavior, secret hotel visits, and a pattern that suggested Swaggart's addiction was not just impulse, but compulsion. Behind the world-famous broadcasts, behind the gospel crusades and televised altar calls, there was a man living a double life, a preacher fighting demons he publicly condemned but privately indulged. It was the classic addiction contradiction, saying what you believed, doing what you swore you hated, and watching a life built on conviction begin to collapse under the weight of secrecy. Swaggart tried to regain footing. He stayed on television, even after losing official credentials. His ministry revenue dipped sharply, but loyal viewers remained. Inside his organization, some staff members believed restoration was possible. Others quietly left, convinced the problem wasn't confession, it was repetition. In 1991, it happened again. Another scandal involving a sex worker, another arrest, and another wave of headlines reminding the world that addiction doesn't go away just because someone cries on camera. The damage to his reputation at that point was irreversible. Every sermon, every broadcast, every revival meeting carried the shadow of what had happened, and American culture never let him forget it. And yet, here is the complicated truth. Jimmy Swaggart didn't disappear. He wasn't crushed by prison time or led away in handcuffs. He kept preaching, built an independent ministry outside denominational control, and continued broadcasting long after the rest of the religious world assumed he was finished. He became a case study in addiction exposed, not because consequences ended his career completely, but because the scandal changed the way millions of people viewed preachers forever. Swaggart's story revealed a painful lesson. Charismatic leadership, can hide deep personal struggle, and public morality can mask private chaos. For many viewers, Swaggart remains a symbol of the cost of secrecy, a reminder that spiritual authority can be shattered overnight by an addiction no one sees until it erupts. His legacy is complicated. Millions were inspired by his music and preaching, yet just as many were scarred by the hypocrisy. And in the aftermath, churches began asking questions they once avoided. Who holds power accountable? What happens when the messenger becomes the warning? Case 4. Ernest Angley. By the time Ernest Angley's crisis finally erupted into the public eye, he was already a household name in Pentecostal circles, his broadcasts reaching millions, his distinct voice instantly recognizable, his persona wrapped in claims of holiness and purity. For decades, he cultivated the image of a miracle-working faith healer, a man who thundered against sexual immorality from the pulpit, while promising supernatural deliverance to anyone who stepped into his Akron sanctuary. But behind the sermons and televised revivals, a darker story was unfolding, one built on control, secrecy, and a compulsive pattern of behavior that would eventually destroy not just reputations, but an entire ministry's legacy. The first cracks appeared when former members quietly left and began sharing stories of manipulation and inappropriate behavior hidden beneath Angley's strict holiness culture. At first, these whispers were easy for his supporters to dismiss. Critics, they said, had axes to grind or were exaggerating isolated incidents. But then came the lawsuits. Then came brave testimonies from men who said they endured coercive sexual behavior disguised as counseling, deliverance, or spiritual instruction. It was no longer rumor. It was allegation backed by documentation, sworn statements, and years of patterns all pointing to the same disturbing theme. Tragically, some of Angley's teachings themselves became part of the evidence. He was accused of demanding vasectomies from male staff members, of controlling intimate decisions, of treating bodies and boundaries like property belonging solely to him and his ministry. What made this scandal even more shocking was how long it simmered before finally exploding in public view. Local news reporters began digging, producing long-form investigative pieces that laid out the allegations in stark, unemotional detail. Court filings followed, naming the ministry, leadership, and Angley himself, accusing them of exploitation and psychological coercion. People who had once defended him as a God-anointed leader began questioning everything they thought they knew. For many, the hardest part wasn't believing the accusations. It was admitting that years of loyalty had blinded them to warning signs they now couldn't unsee. And as more former members came forward, the narrative of one disgruntled former follower collapsed under the weight of multiple corroborating accounts. Angley never offered a full confession. He denied wrongdoing, tried to frame accusations as spiritual attacks, and at times blamed the devil for stirring lies against him. But denial couldn't stop the damage. Attendance plummeted. Donations evaporated. Ministries that once operated like well-oiled media machines began shrinking, then closing. The fallout extended beyond finances. Lifelong relationships shattered, families divided. People who had trusted Angley with their deepest vulnerabilities were left wrestling with betrayal, trauma, and the painful task of rebuilding faith after spiritual abuse. By the end, the man who once stood on television sets promising miracles was no longer a respected spiritual father. He had become a cautionary tale whispered in church hallways and survivor support groups. Court cases and investigative articles remain online to this day, ensuring the record of what happened never disappears into rumor or revision. And the legacy of Ernest Angley now reads like a tragic study in secrecy, addiction to control, and unchecked power, a ministry built on holiness, undone by the very behavior it condemned. Case 5. Perry Noble. It's almost impossible to explain how beloved Perry Noble once was in Southern evangelical culture unless you lived through those years when New Spring Church in South Carolina was one of the fastest-growing congregations in America. At its peak, New Spring wasn't just a church, it was a movement. Tens of thousands packed multiple campuses every Sunday. Worship teams released original music, young adults flooded services during college breaks, and Perry's sermons, energetic, disarmingly honest, often sprinkled with humor and vulnerable self-revelation, made him a national conference speaker and best-selling author. The man seemed unstoppable, a pastor who connected effortlessly with people tired of stiff, buttoned-up religion. He preached authenticity, transparency, and community. Behind that stage confidence, however, was a secret he had been outrunning for years. Alcohol had slowly become his coping mechanism, his offstage refuge, and then his unspoken dependency. The exposure didn't arrive with sirens, scandals, or tabloid leaks. It came with silence, the kind that hangs in the air when a megachurch abruptly tells thousands of worshipers the senior pastor is being removed. In July 2016, New Spring's leadership board released a stunning announcement from the pulpit. Perry Noble had been terminated for personal and leadership issues, specifically citing alcohol use and concerns over marriage and decision-making. The statement made clear that the board had attempted interventions and offered help, but the addiction had progressed to a point where action became unavoidable. In an emotional written confession later, Perry admitted that he had indeed developed an unhealthy dependence on alcohol to deal with stress, expectations, and the constant pressure to perform as the pastor of one of America's most influential churches. There was no criminal drama, just a heartbreaking realization that charisma and success could not protect him from the same numbing escape millions turned to. The fallout was immediate and painful. New Spring members, many of whom had been there since the church's earliest days, struggled to process what had happened. National evangelical leaders weighed in, some offering compassion, others quietly distancing themselves. Critics questioned whether megachurch structures themselves contribute to addiction, fueling pressure, isolation, and unchecked power. Perry disappeared from public preaching almost overnight. One Sunday, he was everywhere. Video screens, leadership conferences, book promotions. The next Sunday, he wasn't allowed to step on stage at the place he had built from the living room up. Supporters described the moment like mourning a living person, grief mixed with confusion and disappointment. But that wasn't where his story ended. Treatment, counseling, and a long season away from the spotlight slowly reshaped Perry's next chapter. Within a couple of years, he began reappearing, cautiously, imperfectly, first through social media videos, then leadership coaching, and eventually in a small pastoral role outside the confines of traditional megachurch expectations. His tone changed. The polished, joke-filled preacher became a man who now openly talked about relapse, shame, therapy, recovery, and boundaries. Whereas early Perry Noble preached strength, later Perry Noble talked about weakness and the reality that ministry can either heal a soul or crush one. The addiction didn't disappear overnight, but it forced a public reckoning that allowed thousands of others to admit their own struggles. Today, Perry remains in ministry, though not at the scale of New Spring. He leads much smaller communities, writes about mental health, and works with others dealing with substance dependency. Some people in evangelical culture never forgave him. Others say he became more real after the fall. If the pattern of this entire documentary series shows anything, it's that secret addictions don't care about faith, fame, or influence. They expose everyone eventually, and for Perry Noble, the collapse of a multi-million-dollar mega-church empire became the beginning of sobriety, humility, and the difficult, ongoing climb toward rebuilding a life and ministry from the ground up. Case 6. Ravi Zacharias. For decades, Ravi Zacharias was the man evangelical leaders brought out when they needed someone who could hold his own in a debate on college campuses, defend Christianity on CNN, or speak to crowds of intellectual skeptics without losing composure. His Indian accent, calm demeanor, and razor-sharp logic gave him a saint-like reputation in apologetics circles. He built an international platform through RZIM, his global ministry, with radio broadcasts, best-selling books, and lecture tours that reached millions. To many, he was the embodiment of moral rationality, the brilliant Christian thinker who lived above scandal. But beneath that polished exterior, there were warning signs no one wanted to look at closely. Rumors circulated for years about inappropriate communications, whispered accusations from massage therapists, and secret lawsuits that somehow disappeared from public view before they could gain traction. Supporters dismissed the allegations, insisting that Ravi was a target for enemies of the faith. Everything changed after his death in 2020. In the months following his funeral, allegations that had once been quietly buried resurfaced with unexpected force. A group of whistleblowers demanded accountability, documenting the existence of spa businesses that Ravi owned or partially controlled. Testimonies began to pile up, not from hostile outsiders, but from women who had been deeply affected by his private life. At first, the organization attempted to deflect, issuing cautious statements affirming their founder's legacy and questioning the credibility of the claims. But the pressure mounted, and the board of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries made a decision that changed the evangelical world. They hired an independent law firm to investigate their own founder. No spin, no internal review committee, no friendly church panel, but outside attorneys given full access to records, testimonies, bank accounts, and digital evidence. The findings were devastating. The investigation documented patterns of sexual misconduct, secret financial accounts used to support private behavior, coercive messages, and evidence of long-term addiction to sexual gratification hidden beneath ministry travel and public appearances. Far from isolated incidents, investigators found a multi-year, multi-country pattern of abuse that Ravi controlled through money, intimidation, and religious manipulation. Women reported feeling spiritually blackmailed, convinced they could not come forward because he was so revered. Some described how he used prayers, scriptural language, and pastoral authority to justify his behavior, all while publicly presenting himself as a champion of purity, discipline, and intellectual faith. The backlash was immediate and severe. Bookstores pulled his works from shelves. Major Christian radio networks removed programs bearing his name. Seminaries and campus ministries released public statements acknowledging that they had platformed a man whose secret life contradicted everything he preached. Perhaps the most painful part for believers was that the truth emerged only when he could no longer respond or seek reconciliation. There would be no confession, no tearful repentance service, no opportunity for accountability in life. Only the slow unraveling of a legacy people had trusted for half a century. RZIM itself, once a global institution with thousands of donors, effectively dissolved under the weight of the report. Employees publicly apologized to victims, some resigned, others admitted they had dismissed concerns out of loyalty. The organization liquidated assets and diverted funds to support survivors, and in the end, Ravi Zacharias became a name synonymous with a particular kind of tragedy, the collapse of a spiritual icon after death, leaving questions that can never be answered directly by the man at the center of it all. Even now, the case sparks debate in Christian circles about how charisma and talent can mask addiction and how institutions can unknowingly enable double lives. The facts remain heartbreaking and undeniable. One of the most celebrated Christian thinkers of the modern era lived with a secret that destroyed not only his reputation, but the trust of countless people who believed his words and followed his teachings. This case forces us to ask a chilling question. How do you seek closure when the truth only comes to light after the voice behind it is gone forever? Case 7. Mark Driscoll. Mar Driscoll built his reputation in Seattle as a fearless, unapologetic preacher who seemed to thrive on controversy. Mars Hill Church wasn't just another megachurch, It became a cultural force in the early 2000s, drawing thousands of mostly young, restless Christians looking for certainty, masculinity, and direction. Driscoll's sermons were raw, aggressive, and often shocking. He preached with the intensity of a man who believed he had divine clarity in a confused world. His rise fit perfectly with the era of podcasted sermons and online ministry growth, and soon, Mars Hill operated like a multi-campus corporation, books, conferences, leadership seminars, and a national following that made Driscoll one of the most influential evangelical voices of his generation. But behind the growth, a darker pattern started forming. One not tied to substance or sexual scandal, but something more insidious. An addiction to control, domination, and power. Staff began whispering stories of intimidation. Volunteers described a culture of fear masked as bold leadership. Former elders claimed Driscoll's private behavior didn't match the confident preacher on Sunday. Multiple investigations later described his leadership style using terms normally reserved for toxic workplaces: bullying, verbal attacks, and emotional manipulation. And as Mars Hill expanded, so did the number of people quietly pushed aside or removed entirely when they questioned his authority. The exposure moment came not from tabloids or a shocking arrest, but from internal documentation. Emails, testimony, meeting notes, and eventually a whistleblower leak to media outlets. By 2014, Mars Hill's governing body, known as the Board of Advisors and Accountability, initiated a formal investigation into the growing list of allegations. Former pastors and staff members went public with stories of being humiliated in meetings, forced resignations, and disciplinary actions for disagreeing with Driscoll's decisions. A leaked letter described him as exhibiting a pattern of domineering leadership that had become spiritually and emotionally damaging to those closest to him. One of the major flashpoints was a revelation that church funds had allegedly been used to manipulate sales of Driscoll's book Real Marriage in order to secure a spot on the New York Times bestseller list. That moment crystallized the underlying problem: the obsession with image, platform, and influence, even at the expense of integrity. The very tools Driscoll once used to build a brand now became evidence of a leader who couldn't step away from his need to be the center of it all. As congregants learned more, confusion turned to grief, then to anger. Mars Hill, a church with 13 campuses and tens of thousands of weekly attendees, suddenly looked less like a spiritual movement and more like a corporate empire crashing under the weight of internal dysfunction. When the investigation findings were delivered, Driscoll resigned rather than submit to a restoration plan recommended by the church's elders. Within weeks, Mars Hill dissolved completely, one of the fastest implosions in megachurch history. The aftermath exposed just how much damage addiction to power can inflict. Former members described years of therapy to recover from what they experienced inside the movement. Pastors who served under Driscoll scattered to smaller churches or left ministry altogether. Podcast investigations, documentaries, and journalism later revisited the story, calling it one of the most cautionary tales in modern church history. Driscoll, however, never disappeared. He relocated and resurfaced with a new church hundreds of miles away, promising a fresh approach, though many critics noted the same leadership patterns reappearing in different forms. Driscoll's story forces a difficult truth into focus. Addiction isn't always chemical. Sometimes it's a hunger for control, applause, and the feeling of being irreplaceable. And in ministry, where leaders often face little accountability and enormous loyalty, that addiction can go unnoticed for years, until every hidden fault collapses, bringing an entire church down with it. Case 8. Kevin Prosch. Long before his name was tied to disciplinary letters and hushed church meetings, Kevin Prosch was one of the most innovative voices in modern worship. His music carried a raw, prophetic edge that broke away from traditional church melodies. Crowds responded to the authenticity in his voice, the longing in his lyrics, and the sense that he was living out every song he sang. But behind that artistic freedom, a darker and more human struggle was unfolding in secret. Inswise, Prosch's addiction wasn't a sudden implosion or a tabloid scandal. It was slow, layered, and devastating in a different way, a cycle of adultery, hidden shame, and ministry misconduct that ate away at the very credibility that once made him a leader in worship renewal. What makes Prosch fall particularly striking is that his exposure didn't come through crime or national headlines. It came through church discipline statements, spread quietly among congregations and leadership circles in the 1,990 SS. Elders, pastors, and ministry boards confronted the reality that a man known for romantic language in worship had become entangled in relationships that crossed pastoral and moral boundary. The way the truth surfaced brought pain on multiple levels. Prosch confessed to affairs, acknowledged emotional manipulation, and admitted that addictive behavior had turned into a secret life. For congregations who had sung his songs on Sunday mornings, it felt like betrayal from the inside. A voice they trusted as a vessel of brokenness and healing, now revealed as someone carrying hidden damage. The heartbreak for many is that Prosch did not fit the stereotype of the celebrity preacher living in excess. His addiction was inward and relational, tied to validation, attention, and emotional escape. He stepped down from leadership roles and entered periods of accountability and counseling, but the damage inside ministry networks was already done. Churches distanced themselves, collaborations disappeared. Many worship leaders who once considered him a mentor stopped mentioning his name because association risked congregational backlash. Publicly, he receded from the spotlight, not in a dramatic exit, but in a slow fade, a disappearance marked by shame and silence. Yet even in that collapse, a complicated truth remains. Those closest to Prosch describe someone who genuinely wanted healing, but struggled to break free from patterns that were decades deep. He continued recording independently, releasing music without major promotional backing, far from the conference stages and mass worship events that once embraced him. Supporters argue that his transparency about brokenness deserves a different kind of restoration story. Critics believe the harm done, especially to church members and ministry relationships, should never be minimized or forgotten. Both realities coexist, creating one of the more nuanced collapses in the worship world. Neither fully condemned nor fully rehabilitated, just unresolved. Today, Kevin Prosch appears occasionally in niche music spaces, distant from mainstream church platforms. His name still sparks debate. Some call him a cautionary tale about emotional addiction in ministry, while others see him as proof that giftedness and brokenness can inhabit the same soul, sometimes with tragic consequences. His story warns that secret addictions don't always look like drugs or money or celebrity recklessness. Sometimes they look like a worship leader, writing songs about longing for God, while privately battling a hunger that kept destroying the people closest to him. Case 9. Sammie Okposo. The scandal didn't begin with a tabloid leak or a hidden camera. It started with Sammie Okposo opening his own phone, typing a confession, and pressing post. In January 2022, at the height of his popularity as one of Nigeria's most recognizable gospel recording artists, he went on Instagram and publicly admitted to an extramarital affair. It was brief, blunt, and devastatingly honest. In a world where religious leaders often hide their addictions behind coded language or carefully managed statements, Okposo's post read like a man exhausted by secrecy. The tone was contrite, shaken, and desperate for grace. Within hours, his name was on every major gospel blog, radio commentators were dissecting every word, and the very industry that had lifted him up for decades began distancing themselves from him in real time. Sammie Okposo wasn't a marginal figure in African gospel music. He was a giant. Born in Delta State, he rose through the 1990s and 2000s as one of the architects of modern praise and worship in Nigeria, blending American-style choirs with African rhythms and brilliant studio polish. Songs like Welu Welu, Naija Praise, and Sing Hallelujah made him a staple at concerts, crusades, and major worship gatherings across multiple continents. He was the kind of artist churches booked years in advance. He had endorsement deals, international tours, and a level of influence that made him both a cultural ambassador and a bridge between entertainment and ministry. But behind all of that momentum was a private life, spiraling under pressure, temptation, and the exhaustion that comes from living two different realities, one public and spotless, the other grinding, flawed, and hidden. When the confession hit, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Major event organizers dropped him from upcoming ministry programs. Churches that once hosted him quickly removed his name from promotional materials. Interviews were canceled. Some leaders praised him for confessing rather than being caught. Others condemned him for bringing dishonor to the gospel, and although the addiction here was not to substances but to secrecy, approval, and sexual compulsion, the fallout looked painfully familiar. Okposo announced he was stepping back from ministry to seek restoration, counseling, and repentance. He disabled comments, stopped performing publicly, and disappeared from stages that once felt like home. The silence that followed was not just professional, it was emotional isolation, the kind many religious leaders face after their addictions finally break through the polished surface of ministry life. What makes his story especially tragic is that it didn't end with a dramatic comeback or televised restoration narrative. Sammie Okposo died unexpectedly in November 2022, less than a year after that confession. There were no Hollywood-style redemption arcs, no last-minute revival tour that wiped away the scandal. Instead, the gospel world was forced to sit with a blend of grief and unfinished business. Some people remembered the excitement of his concerts, the joy he brought to worship. Others revisited the scandal, the apology, and the difficult questions about the pressures artists face in environments that demand perfection. There was sadness, confusion, tenderness, and sometimes anger, not toward him personally, but toward a system that elevates human beings into impossible roles and then abandons them when they admit their weakness. Today, people don't speak of Sammie Okposo in simple categories of fallen or restored. His name is now associated with caution, compassion, and complexity. He was a man beloved by millions, a talented pioneer of gospel music in Africa, and someone who, in his final year, told the truth about his struggle and paid a heavy price for it. His story forces a hard, necessary question. How many other worship leaders are drowning in private addictions and silent battles, terrified that confession will cost them everything, yet unable to keep pretending they're fine? Case 10. Lonnie Frisbee. Lonnie Frisbee's story does not begin in a pulpit, but on the California coast in the late 1960s. Barefoot, long-haired, and radiating the strange combination of innocence and brokenness that would come to define his legacy. He was a hippie before he was a preacher, drifting between communes, experimenting with drugs, and trying to quiet the turbulence inside him with whatever would numb the pain. By the time he encountered a group of young Jesus seekers in Orange County, his life had already been shaped by trauma, addiction, longing, and questions he didn't yet have language for. But when he stepped inside Calvary Chapel, something seemed to ignite. Pastors saw in him an unusual gift, an ability to reach young people no one else could understand. It was the era of runaway teens, LSD, and a counterculture movement that was ready to burn down the past. Lonnie Frisbee became the bridge, a firebrand evangelist whose charisma sparked what historians later called the Jesus movement. In front of crowds that spilled out of buildings, Frisbee preached with urgency and prayed with a kind of raw, emotional vulnerability that made people weep. Stories circulated of instant conversions, drug addicts breaking down, and entire living rooms turning into worship gatherings within hours. To the public, he was a miracle worker, a spirit-filled preacher, and a rising star of West Coast revival culture. But, behind the scenes, the addictions he thought he'd outrun returned like a tide. At first, it was quiet, just whispers among leadership that something was off, that Frisbee's nights were unpredictable, that he rushed into ministry moments with a desperation that seemed less like inspiration and more like someone running from something. His battles with sexual identity, substance use, and secret relationships began to surface in hidden ways. He bounced between churches, ministries, and leadership positions, alternately celebrated and cautioned, promoted and quietly removed. Those close to him later revealed that his addictive cycles weren't just about substances. They were tied to loneliness, shame, and attempts to navigate desires he felt he couldn't openly confess in the evangelical world of the 1970s and 1980s. When the first leadership discussions began about discipline and restoration, they weren't public. They were handled behind closed doors, in meetings where reputations were discussed like fragile objects that could crack under the slightest pressure. But then came exposure. Memoirs, testimonies, and insider accounts finally began surfacing, painting a picture of a man torn in two. Part revival preacher, part deeply broken soul trying to self-medicate trauma and inner conflict just to keep functioning. His addiction strained relationships everywhere he served. He lost leadership positions. He lost networks. He lost, in many ways, the high-profile ministry influence he once held with ease. And every time he attempted a comeback, the old patterns waited for him, just beyond the applause. The tragedy of Lonnie Frisbee is not a scandal headline. It's a man whose addiction stole from him the very ministry he helped birth. When he became the subject of documentaries decades later, the story shifted away from the shock of exposure and toward a deeper question. How does someone used so powerfully become consumed by battles no one knew how to address? Without proper structures around addiction recovery, emotional support, or honesty about sexuality in ministry environments, Frisbee lived most of his life in a kind of spiritual exile, adored publicly, isolated privately. He eventually stepped away from the spotlight entirely. Over time, addiction took its toll on his health and stability. Where others saw a legend, he saw a lifetime of unresolved pain. Yet those who knew him insist his heart never changed. He wanted to see people meet God, even when he didn't know how to care well for himself. His legacy today is complicated but undeniably influential. Entire movements trace their roots to his preaching. Yet his name was buried by the institutions he helped build. Only after his death did many begin acknowledging how essential he was to American revival history. Lonnie Frisbee stands as a sobering final portrait in this series, a reminder that addiction is rarely just a bad habit, but often a quiet cry for help that ministry culture has historically ignored. His story leaves one question burning for anyone watching. How many leaders are still out there, performing miracles publicly while fighting personal collapse in silence? In every story we just walked through, the same pattern kept repeating itself: a celebrated voice, a respected leader, a powerful personality whose public confidence masked a private war they could not control. Secret addictions didn't just threaten reputations. They turned entire ministries upside down, hurt families, scattered congregations, and left thousands of followers confused, heartbroken, or betrayed. No pulpit is tall enough to hide the reality that human beings struggle in silence, and no spotlight is bright enough to erase the truth once it finally surfaces. Some of these leaders confessed, repented, and tried to rebuild. Others doubled down, denied the allegations, or allowed their empires to burn rather than face what was eating them from the inside. But when the dust settled, every one of these cases forced people to confront an uncomfortable question. How can someone preach deliverance to millions and yet be unable to escape the chains wrapped around their own life? The stories show there is no simple villain or clean-cut moral. Addiction is powerful, secretive, strategic, and often devastating not just to the person in its grip, but to everyone around them. But they also remind us that exposure can sometimes open the door to healing, if there is honesty, if there is accountability, and if there are people willing to tell the truth, even when it's painful. As we close this investigation, one thing becomes clear. Faith and fame can never fully erase human weakness, and the cost of ignoring it is always higher than anyone expects. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Which case shocked you the most? And why do you think so many public leaders hide their personal battles until everything explodes? Drop your thoughts in the comments section and let's talk about it. If you appreciate this type of honest, well-researched storytelling that doesn't look away from the hard parts of history, please subscribe to Savage Case Files. Your support keeps this channel alive and motivates us to bring you new episodes every single day.